For Pennsylvania hunters and conservationists, our roots run deep. The episodes we bring to you on the Pennsylvania Game Commission's podcast, Call of the Outdoors, will take a deep dive into exposing the incredible work being done by agency staff and partners, including statewide habitat projects, the science behind wildlife management, and what drives agency decisions. The Pennsylvania Game Commission's mission is twofold: to manage and protect wildlife and their habitats for not only current but future generations, and to promote hunting and trapping in the Keystone State. Hello and welcome to Pennsylvania Game Commission's podcast, Call of the Outdoors. I mean, it's like Christmas around here because we're right in the heart of deer season. And we got a couple back-to-back episodes here that we're going to talk about a lot of things. But this morning's guest, very happy to have him this morning. Welcome, Paul Weiss, our Chief Forester here at the Game Commission. We're going to talk a lot about a lot of the activities that happen here at PGC when it relates to trees and forests, habitats, and some of the effects that deer can have on that. But welcome, Paul, and if you would just tell our guests out there a little bit about yourself and how you landed here at the Game Commission.
No, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. So I've been here at the Game Commission for 5 years, been the Chief Forester for about 1.5 years now. I actually started in the private sector in the timber industry. I worked as a consultant forester for 6.5, almost 7 years up in northern PA. Then I was a forest health specialist with DCNR for over 10 years, and then I ended up here at the Game Commission. And I've worked all over the state. I've worked all over the industry, and this is the most fun I've had in this career so far. I love it here.
It comes with its challenges, but I feel the same way, coming from the hunting industry and like the challenges and the fun at PGC. There's just so much going on. And the greatest thing is the way that we can help give back for the future, which is part of our mission, and I can't believe we've had to put up with you for 5 years already. That's crazy. But, let's just get right into it. Let's talk about, I'm going to ask you your definition of a word that's used everywhere in life right now, but what it really means here at the Game Commission, and that's habitat. If you took a broad stroke at habitat, let's hear your definition.
So to me, habitat is all of the requirements being met for any animal has to live, whether it's people, whether it's deer, whether it's squirrels. It's got to have food, it's got to have cover, it's got to have water, and it's got to have areas to raise their young.
Right.
So that to me is habitat. If you're missing one of those components, you don't have a habitat. You just have where something's passing through.
Right. And missing those components can make things unhealthy. And if you even relate it to human life, if
you
we all
don't have a house, you got a problem.
Right. We're going to be sick, and eventually, lots of things can happen. And it's tough because maintaining those levels, of good habitat or creating, habitat, it just doesn't happen this year. We don't go out there and, saw some trees down. Everybody's like, oh, it's a great clear cut. There's a reason for it. And that's kind of what we want to talk about today.
Yeah. And it's always tricky in our line of work when you talk about creating good habitat and managing good habitat. For our line of work, we don't know if we've been successful for a long time. Even on the short end of things, when we're dealing with things like aspen or poplar that we consider fast growing, short turnaround for good habitat, you still may be talking 5 or 10 years.
Right.
Imagine what it's like in every other job if you don't know if you were successful for a decade.
Right. Well, the vision is the toughest thing for a lot of our folks that are tuning in. The vision that you all have, the vision, our next part with when we talk to David about, the deer herd, the vision is the thing we really got to look at, because we got to leave it better than we found it. And, we got to manage it to the future for children that aren't even born yet. And, when you look at the turn of, into the 1900s, where Pennsylvania was and where it is today in regards to wildlife, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, agreed. You figure you go to the turn of the century and you see the pictures from Williamsport and Tioga County. There were no trees left for as far as the eye could see. What's going to live there?
Right.
The fact that we have the wildlife that we do in Pennsylvania now is it's just this side of a miracle.
I grew up in that era. We're probably close to the same age where, you'd go out and rifle deer season and you'd see a herd of 30 deer, and so many folks want that again. But our deer herd was in dire straits at that time. It was really in a bad place, and habitat is so crucial to where we're at today.
And it's what's got to be remembered. I think we are about the same age. You go back to the 80s, early 90s, the forests that we're looking at were still somewhat young. So they were resilient to any kind of overpressure that was put on them. Now we're getting to the stage where we're starting to see forests die off, whether it's from just age, whether it's from insects and diseases. And so when you put an additional pressure on it, the habitat truly declines at a much more rapid pace than it did 40 years ago, 30 years ago.
Right. So if you would, just from your standpoint, from, the forestry, when you go out there and get in the dirt, and for those of you listening, if you've never been in the woods with a forester, they completely change your life. I mean, they teach you what every tree is. They get down and scrape away leaves, and they get real excited about stuff that's growing in the leaf matter. And for me, in the last 4.5, 5 years, I've learned a whole lot of stuff that I really probably should have never known. But I also feel that if I knew that stuff earlier in life, and we all know what an oak tree is, but I didn't know there was a difference in how a white oak produces mass and how a red oak does. And I want to talk about that a little bit too as we go forward. But a healthy habitat, if there was a perfect world, what's a healthy habitat?
Healthy habitat's going to meet all of the needs that a wide range of wildlife can use. If you have a habitat that's only good for one species, we can't look at that as being successful because we have to manage all of the game species and non-game species in Pennsylvania.
Way over 400 species
yeah.
of birds and mammals.
So what we have to look at is a habitat that can support the greatest number of all of the life needs of the greatest number of wildlife. Now, that's not always going to be in one spot. It's impossible for it to be in one spot. Some animals require old, mature forests with a lot of structure, ability to get up into the canopy. Others, like grouse, require young forest, high density. So the goal for us is to get as much of that in close proximity to each other so they can spend their life moving around through the different habitat types they need to meet everything that they need for a healthy life.
And if you look at, and you correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just visualizing this, it would be like a checkerboard, kind of like my shirt, where you have, where you can mix and match and have those habitats in different areas. There's a term for that, I know.
Well, it's fun. It's called checkerboarding.
Oh, okay.
There's an actual,
like my shirt.
there's an actual management technique, and we've gotten away. They were actual checkerboards in squares, like Game Lands 176 Scotia used to have a giant checkerboard that went through the middle of it for grouse management. Now we've gotten away from the true squares, and now we do interspersion, where we try to kind of follow the landscape.
That's a big word.
Yeah. I try not to use words I can't spell. But where we just match up as much as we can of mature forest next to young forest, next to middle forest, next to open field habitats and wet areas, so that any animal, like even the grouse, we hear a lot about grouse and they're a young forest obligate, but they need open areas where they can take their young to go out and bug and grub around. They need water. They need cover. There'll be at some point they'll go into middle-aged stands and they'll just bounce around in there. So if your whole landscape is nothing but young forest, it doesn't meet what they need.
If you would just talk about like young forest, middle age, and if you can just kind of define that in like Cliff Notes version.
Okay.
Because a lot of times we say young forest and people look at something, myself included, I'm called a young forest and it's really not. But
So the easiest way to put it is young forest would be that stuff that's up to 20, 25 years old. If you're hunting, it's the stuff you don't want to go through. It's the stuff you got to crawl through. It's got briars in it. It's real dense. You get hung up in it. You can't walk a straight line. That's generally speaking, that's what young forest conditions look like.
Makes you cuss when you go through it.
A little bit.
Yeah.
A little bit. Makes you fall down a lot.
But that's what things live in, too.
That's where everything lives. Middle-aged forest, what we call a pole stand, is where everything is about the size of a coffee can around, wide open underneath, not much sun hitting the ground. That's when all the trees are starting to decide who's going to win, who's going to lose. Smaller, less dominant trees start to fall out, and you can see for 400 yards that there's nothing in there. You'll see those are the stands you see in the snow. The deer just go straight through and they never stop because there's no food in there for them. There's nothing growing on the ground. When you start getting into mature forest, that's when you got full canopies. You start getting trees that die and fall off. You start getting into the bigger oak trees that are producing acorns, and you'll start getting the next generation of shrubs and trees that are growing up underneath. So sometimes you have a lot more structure in a mature forest than you do in a middle-aged forest.
That makes a lot of sense because I've always, obviously with the grouse and some of the dilemmas there and when you're looking at that habitat, I know we went for a tour early when I was here at PGC that I think it was the American Bird Conservancy. It was a golden wing warbler.
Yeah, the ABC.
Yeah, it was a stand that they funded and the amount of wildlife that it attracted, but you couldn't walk through it and I mean everything was like this,
yeah.
But for me I never had the vision of what that would turn into and just for just for knowledge, a lot of people, myself included, when you take an oak tree and talk about what it takes from that oak tree, from when an acorn drops, let's say a white oak, from when an acorn drops to when it's producing nuts.
So it's interesting. So for the first year when it drops, it'll start to germinate, put down a little shoot. Now, what little bit depends on what kind of pressure it's under from there, how much light it has, how much, if it's getting browsed or not. But the first couple years of development, it'll just put roots straight down and hardly grow anything up above. So by the time you see a white oak that's like 6 inches tall, it may hit, that acorn may have fallen 5 or 6 years ago. By the time you get it to where it's producing acorns again, we'll probably be dead. You're looking at 30 years, if you're lucky. And when you start getting where you get the big oak trees that you're looking for that are really dropping a lot of mass, you're probably 80 years down the road.
That's crazy.
So we're when we talk about we're trying to regenerate white oak and get white oak to grow, we're not worried about it when it's little. Everybody wants big oak trees. Everybody wants mass production, acorns falling on the ground. From a forester's perspective, we'll never see it happen. It's decades away.
So, and I'm going off track. So, but
there's no track.
When you say get it mature, talk about when a tree has a full canopy and how important that is when you and your crews go through the woods and you're trying to create the perfect producing oak trees or whatever. And this is something that I've really paid attention to just on the places that I've hunted. So many places I go, I'm like, man, we need to get some lighting around there and let that tree really perform to its best, its optimum potential.
So we've seen the potential that can come with some of these forest-grown oak trees that have been released through natural events, wind throw, defoliation, logging practices in the past, and now all of a sudden you have an oak tree that has a 150-foot diameter canopy, and it's just gorgeous sitting there. It's like a giant umbrella full of acorns sitting in the woods. So we've taken that and we've noticed that, and we're starting to find oak trees that are younger in that 25 to 30-year-old range and release them now so we can start growing that bigger and bigger canopies.
Talk about release.
Release means we'll take all of the other trees that are growing around it. In the case of what we're doing, it's every tree that's touching that canopy or over top of it, so that oak becomes the most dominant tree in its sphere of influence. Because those big canopies, they're not just wide, they're deep. And that means they produce a geometrical amount more acorns than if it was just a real tight, small canopy. A lot of those big oaks that grew up with a bunch of other oaks crowding them out, they have real small canopies. They don't produce near as many acorns as a big open ground.
And that's opened my eyes when I walk through the woods and I look, and how many trees I look at, and I see a white oak or red oak, and I look, and it only has half a canopy, and it's dropping acorns like you need a hard hat. And I try to envision, man, if we cut this stuff around here, what it could be.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things I know in your bureau, that a lot of some of the future on the private land stuff that's happening, where we're going to be able to consult or develop plans or work with partners to just try to create better wildlife habitat for the future. And I think the future is bright. We know more now than we ever did. And that's, before we dive any deeper, we talked about healthy habitat. If you would just hit on unhealthy habitat.
So unhealthy habitat, just from a broad strokes, is it can't support the wildlife that should potentially live there. Now, there's a lot of reasons habitat can be unhealthy. We've just gone through 3 straight years of intense gypsy moth activity, where you're going to have lots of mortality. This past spring, we just had severe frost events, especially across the north, where we're seeing lots of mortality on the oak trees. That's going to convert, in some cases, to a fern field. And there's, everybody listening realizes that you don't hunt fern fields, you hunt oak forests. So, those stands can no longer support the wildlife that are going to be there. Anything that doesn't support what should be there, we'll consider unhealthy habitat.
So why is a fern field unhealthy? I mean,
there's no food, there's no cover, there's no structure. Imagine being
it's like a giant parking lot.
It's like a giant parking lot that's green. Imagine being something that's, the size of a squirrel or a rabbit going through there. Every hawk and every owl can see you from 10 miles away, and you'll never make it to the other side. There's nothing in there for deer to eat. There's no cover. It's nothing but pure sunlight for bears. So they're just going to rumble through there at the most. They're never going to stop there.
Good place to take a nap.
Good place to take a nap, maybe lay down in the ferns, but they can't survive there.
Right. And that's something that, as we're looking at this year and talking about this 2-part series. We're talking about harvesting antlerless deer in many areas of the state where we're having trouble with habitat coming back, and that is the tool that we have to use here. But let's talk about forest practices and some of the differences here at our agency at the Game Commission. Obviously at the end of the year when we produce our financials, the timber does create revenue.
It does.
And it is part of our revenue stream. But the amount of work that you guys put on the ground out there, and girls, because there's a lot of foresters. The other thing about foresters, the average person does not want to walk through the woods with any of you guys or girls, because you all know how to pick them up and get up and down hills.
We got
and
places to go.
You do. And generally in Pennsylvania, foresters have one leg that's longer than the other because they're always going uphill.
There's nothing flat.
That's right. But talk about the work that we do here at the agency in comparison to the timber industry, even to our sister agency, DCNR, where their mission's a lot different than ours is.
Their mission is to produce timber volumes while also protecting sensitive sites, water, soil, things like that. But their primary focus is timber. Same with a lot of the private landowners. And I got no problem with that. There's a tremendous value for something like that. Our society needs them to produce that material. We just have a different focus here, and I think that's what makes us different and what makes it fun to be here. We use a lot of the same techniques, but it's always in pursuit of something else. They're always in pursuit of regenerating the best timber value that they can get while producing the best money they could get. Just this past year, and it's been 2 years in a row now, we've done twice as many acres where we paid someone to come in and improve the habitat as we have put out for timber sale. So last year we did 16,000 acres where we paid someone to come in and do habitat improvement. We did a little over 8,000 acres of timber sales. So what that means to me is our focus is purely on habitat, and we'll do whatever it takes to get there, whether we have to pay somebody or if we're lucky enough to get somebody to pay us to do it.
Right. As the wildlife agency, we're responsible for wildlife, and that's what a lot of folks kind of sometimes have a misunderstanding about the timber side of our agency, where you just said, 16,000 acres was money that we've paid to have done for the future. And when you look at that as at a broad spectrum, I've personally been out and saw a lot of the work that's getting done from your side of the shop, and it's pretty amazing. And as a hunter, anybody that takes advantage of our game land system, which we're one of those states, we're lucky to have almost 1.6 million acres that is managed exclusively for wildlife. But as a hunter, if you look in those areas where there's lots of that action that's going on, a lot of times that's where the game is.
Absolutely.
Because you're creating food.
Because we're in pursuit of habitat. So you'll see log trucks rolling down the game lands roads, and people are wondering, why are we selling timber? Why are we cutting timber? We're not cutting timber to cut timber. We talked a little bit earlier about that need for young habitat and young forests on the ground to support different habitat types. The only way we can get there is by regenerating stands and getting the mature canopy gone and cut. And it makes no sense for us to do that and pay for it when someone will pay us for the material. So in that case, we use the methods that the rest of the industry uses, but our goal is the habitat on the back end, not the volume that we're selling.
Right. That's a great point. And I encourage everybody to go out there and check it out, what's going on out there. And there's way more to the woods than walking in there and putting up a deer stand or, going out and figuring out which ridge of turkey is going to come to your call. There's way more to it when you really get in deep, even when we're bringing young hunters or new hunters out in, when you go out there, show them what an oak tree is and explain to them. And, something that I've learned more recent than not is the big difference between a white oak and a red oak, and in their families and how they produce acorns. And because I remember for years I'd hear old timers, well, it's a good red oak year, or it's a good white oak year. Let's talk about the differences in that white oak and red oak families. So
make sure I get this right. The white oak will take 1 year to produce an acorn. Red oak family takes 2 years. So they have to, the red oak is actually, they have to make it through 2 springs to make sure the frost doesn't get them, wind events don't get them, late snow. White oak has to make it through 1 season, but they're still pretty sensitive to those various weather conditions. Now, usually, nature has a way of taking care of itself. Most years, you'll have one or the other, because there always seems to be this design in place to make sure that there's something happening, whether it's red or white. Year like this year, everything seems to be blowing up. White and chestnut oak on the white side, red, black, scarlet on the red family side. They're all falling at the same time. And one reason, they have to produce so many acorns to get one tree to grow is because everything wants to eat them. So they have to produce thousands upon thousands of acorns in order to replace themselves. And that's basically all you're looking at. But there's such an important food source that if you lose that, everything falls apart.
Right. One thing too that I've heard recently, actually Dave Gustafson was trying to give me a 101 on oaks, where a white oak falls and pretty soon the root's tapping.
Yeah.
Where a red oak lays till the next year.
Yeah.
And the root taps. And that makes the red oaks a lot more palatable later in the year. Like a lot of times as the season progresses, as a hunter, you might want to focus more on some red oak stuff that you see out there, and if you really think about it and watch deer sign, it makes total sense.
Yeah. They'll hit the white oaks early, especially when they're falling in a year like this. They'll be all over them because they know they can sit there and wait, and you'll see them digging through the snow to eat the red oaks later in the year. But early on, and sometimes that timing really messes it up for hunters because the white oaks will fall like a week or two before archery season. And you'll be all set up, ready for it. By the time archery gets here, they'll have scarfed them all up, and they'll be gone and on to the next type.
I should have learned that a long time. Well, 3 or 4 years ago in the podcast, we had Corey Galvis on, who, he took a giant buck up in Tioga County on public. And obviously he's a forester, and he was out looking for red oaks, and there's a reason for that. That's if we take anything away from this as a hunter, that's probably a pretty good thing if you didn't know about it, is not only just look for those white oaks, which is their favorite. All animals love white oaks, but there's a time and place when you really got to shift looking for other stuff out there. And there's all kinds of things. Oak trees aren't the only thing they eat out there. I know bear hunters, bears prefer the chestnut oak. A lot of bear hunters, travel lots of distances to try to find, and the more time you put in there and the more you can learn about the woods out there, the more successful you are at seeing game. I don't care if you're hunting squirrels or rabbits or whatever.
You got to know what they eat.
Habitat.
You don't know what they eat, you don't know where they're going to be.
That's the key, and it's the key to have healthy populations, and that's what I want to talk about next a little bit is what effect can white-tailed deer probably have the most effect on creating or habitat as we look into the future. And one of the reasons, as we experienced this past June when hunting license went on sale, we have 800 and 900,000 hunters that are very excited to come get their antlerless tags.
Yeah.
And really why those, and we're going to get more into this when we get to David's side too, that why are those antlerless tags so important is so we can keep our deer herd healthy and keep our habitat. Everything has to play in sync.
There's a balance. If the habitat declines, there's no way you're going to have a healthy deer population because they're not going to have anywhere to eat, anywhere to live, anywhere to raise their young. If the deer population gets out of balance, you're not going to have a healthy habitat because one of the interesting conundrums about deer is when you manage for them, they have a tendency to eat their own habitat. And where that really becomes a problem, it's not just their habitat. They share the woods with squirrels and rabbits and turkeys and bears. So if they get out of balance with the habitat,
and golden wing warblers,
and grouse, we can't grow any young for, so we can't get any of that high density stuff that we talked about for the warblers and the grouse. It's hard to get through the stuff that grows all the blackberries and the raspberries, and if you can't ever get that young stuff, you can never get the next mature forest, which is going to be habitat as well. So that's where that balance has to come in play between habitat and deer.
And when you have a lot of deer and you're trying to recreate or regrow a great forest, all that remains is stuff that deer don't want to eat.
Yeah. Unfortunately, some of their favorite food is the stuff we're trying to grow. Things like oak trees. They love to eat oak trees. They love to eat maple trees. And we're trying to grow things like that for habitat for the next. And, they tend to leave behind stuff like fern, grasses, and birch and beech and things like that we don't necessarily want.
Mm-hmm. So I know one thing I've learned just walking and spending time with foresters, when you take a small oak tree, maybe my height, which isn't very high, 5'7.5" on a good day. Explain how, if you could look at that little oak tree and you can tell just where that tree's probably been browsed and how long it's taken that tree to just get 5 feet.
Yeah, we'll start with some of the smaller ones. You'll see oak trees that are about knee high, maybe a little bit less, that the base of them is bigger around than your thumb, which means they've been browsed back repeatedly. And you see they won't grow straight. They'll go up and they'll look a little bit like a bonsai tree. They go lower to the right, lower to the left. All of the lower limbs are just stumpy. That's been browsed repeatedly. And if we can get it to that 5'7" mark, we're just about there. They're just to be about to the point where deer can't reach it another and it'll be above their head. Another foot or two, it'll make it. But if we can't get it past that first 3 or 4 feet, it won't make it. It'll just, everything else will grow so much faster that the deer aren't eating that oak tree will die off.
And it's probably taken that tree 10 years to get there.
Yeah.
I mean,
there's a lot of oak trees that are 10 years old that are about a foot tall.
Right. And that's why you see a lot of folks, especially folks that are really into their, creating habitat or working for better habitat on their private land. They'll tube a tree to get it to grow towards the sun and get it 6 feet in the air.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't have that browse pressure. And let's talk about, we kind of hit on it a little bit, but what that impact of deer does, throughout the term of trying to regenerate forests. When we look at it as an overabundance of deer, like the area is not holding the area is holding more deer than it should.
So what tends to happen in areas, and I'm picturing some that have where the deer have exploded, for lack of a better term, in a very localized area, is we can't get literally anything to grow over a couple of inches tall. You'll get in areas where there's plenty of sunlight on the ground, but there's still plenty of seed source, so we ought to be able to grow something, and it ends up looking like that fern field that we talked about earlier, where nothing wants to live. And you can get down. Deer are a little bit like people. They're not going to put more effort into anything if they don't have to. You get down and you crawl through and you pull some of those ferns back. You'll see there'll be a layer of maple and oak that are about 2 inches shorter than the fern, because they'll just walk along and eat it right at the fern top. So those trees only survive like that for so long until they just give up. They use all their stores up in their roots and they can't make it anymore. And when you have deer numbers that are too high, all the work we talked about doing before, all the habitat work, all that creativity, it all goes away, because if we can't get anything to grow, then we can't get anything to grow to the next stage.
Right. And if you look at it, a lot of times we think numbers too high, and I don't want to get too far in the weeds on this at all, but when you put dinner out there and something to eat, those deer can come from a long ways. They're not necessarily living on that state game lands. I mean, everybody's got the benefits or the not benefits of those numbers, but when there's food there, they'll come for a long way to get it, just like we would. If we had a single source of food as humans, we'd all be there tonight.
Yeah, we would.
I mean, that's just how it is. And the other thing about browse, that's a line that one of those words, it's like habitat, it's like conservation. Browse is something that is really misunderstood. I mean, deer have to have that browse, and correct me if I'm wrong, and it might be a wives' tale, but I've heard that a adult whitetail needs 5 pounds of browse per day.
I've heard the same thing.
So
imagine how many little seedlings and trees that are a foot tall or shorter it takes to add up to 5 pounds.
And browse isn't anything but the end of a limb, or it's not the whole tree.
And the twigs,
right,
and the leaves.
So that tells you right there what it needs for that deer to be sustainable, and to make it and be healthy, and it is important, and that's what we want to talk about is why it is so important to have a healthy deer herd, to have healthy habitats, healthy forests, and encourage everybody to pay more attention than just seeing deer out there, but look around your surroundings and see what's growing, see what you can see, and think about the future and how important it is when you do get an opportunity to harvest an antlerless deer, how important it is to the future of not just hunting the deer herd, but the habitat that we have here in Pennsylvania.
For everything. And you touched on it a little bit. Numbers don't really matter of deer. If you have poor habitat for a long range, and then all of a sudden you go in and you start doing work that really improves the habitat, put some browse on the ground, they will come from miles around. And you don't have that many deer, but it's more deer than that 50 acres, 100 acres that you just put out there can support. So it's important to not just do, we try not to just do one-off projects, standalone projects. We try to do that landscape level, so we have habitat that spreads everything out and gives everything a chance to live. And if it's so important to have a balance of habitat and deer. because if the habitat starts to decline and fall apart, the deer herd will fall apart. They can't survive if they don't eat. They're just like everything else. They have to have something to eat, and if we can't keep the habitat in a healthy state, the deer numbers will eventually follow.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, all wildlife.
All wildlife.
And when you look at a big picture across the country, not just in Pennsylvania, you know, as many times as we want to maybe complain about something or this and that, we're in the best of times. I mean, when you think about the information that we have today on everything from hunting tactics to forestry to, you know, management, and like the stuff that is available today and the amount of information that we've collected for a long time, you know, we're living in the best of times. I mean, we have some things that are trying to come in here, and we're going to talk about that in the second part, like disease and things like that. And habitat's such a crucial part to managing our herd with those diseases that are out there. I mean, it's crucial.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, Mother Nature's Mother Nature, but I think we're doing a pretty dang good job. I know your bureau's really, you know, we look at diseases in species of trees. I mean, we don't have an ash tree left. I mean, the hemlocks are
no longer a functional part of the system. We have ones that hang out and survive in pockets. If you go back over the last century, which for, you know, the life of a forest is a blink of an eye, we've lost the chestnut tree, we've lost the ash tree, we've lost the beech tree, and we've lost the hemlock tree. Those are all very important wildlife trees that we've lost, that we're trying to manage in the face of that loss. And, you know, through, you know, foresters in Pennsylvania, not through anything that they did wrong, they're just reacting to things that were forced upon them.
Yeah, no, I almost cried the other night. I have one of my favorite stands. I have it jacked up in an oak, but right around it is two hemlocks, and they're just high enough to get me some good cover. I went in there the other day, and they're brown, you know, and it's inevitable.
Yeah.
But like, still have cover this year, but they're gone, you know, and it's sad. And you know, it like you said, you're in the face of a lot of things, and like gypsy moth, you know, we're fixing to lose a ton of production when it comes to oak trees as this wave is hitting us. And maybe hit on that a little bit, what the future might hold. I mean, I know it's kind of a dice roll, but what you're looking at and what we're doing to try to do the best save that we can.
Yeah, so just give everybody a little bit of an idea. Each of the last 2 years, we've had just shy of 1 million acres of defoliation from gypsy moth. And some of that is overlapping acreage between 22 and 23, which is even worse for those stands. What we're going to do on game lands, which is all we can control, is we're going to try to be a little bit patient at first, because, you know, maybe more of those oak trees survive than we expect to. If we have areas of large scale mortality from it, we're going to go in and not just salvage it, you know, to get the trees out there to dead. We're going to go in and actively manage those stands, try to set them up as a shelterwood process or a seed tree. Something, we'll herbicide it if we have to, if there's interference. But we're going to do is it's going to up our management timeline. We're not going to go in and just salvage just to regain the value.
Right. Every game lands, all 300 plus of them, have a comprehensive management plan.
Correct.
And you know, and those are open to the public to take a look at if they want to, and to see what's happening on each game lands. But talk about that comprehensive plan, and you know, we're kind of getting away from what we're talking about, but I think it's important that our viewers, our listeners, understand how much time, effort, energy gets put into every single game lands throughout the whole state.
So the comprehensive management plan is considered comprehensive because the forestry division, the biologist, and the land management all work together to put together a vision of what that game lands is going to look like 10 years from now, and the steps that it takes to get from point A to point B over 10 years. And at the 5-year mark, we'll stop and see where we're at, check in the mirror, see where we came from, and see if we have to make any directions. But it's all based on a combination of the available habitat and the wildlife focus that is going to happen on that game lands, and how we can bring the two of them together.
Right, and that's why when we get into Davis part, like allocating those antlerless tags and what, I mean, it's a tough job because it's tough to make everybody happy. But our most important, no, you can't. And our most important focus is the resource itself. I mean, that's what we have to look for, because we all want to leave our job, and we want to leave this earth, and hopefully the people that are behind us can enjoy the outdoors as much as we do. And whether it's white-tailed deer, wild turkeys, or, you know, any bird watch, whatever you're into, that wildlife is our goal, and that's, I know from your division, that's your goal every day. But any advice, any good stories that you want to wrap up with, because we're about out of time here for part one. But I appreciate, number one, we appreciate you coming on and talking and giving us, you know, a ground level look at it, and we'll definitely do it again. And maybe someday we'll get out in the woods and we can crawl around and get our noses dirty with you, and you can show us a lot more. I know you would. I know you would. But any closing remarks? I know you said your brother's hunting a big bear today, and deer season's coming, and you're a hunter. You love it as much as anybody.
This is the week when I start randomly taking off days to see if I can go kill something.
There you go. And helping the purpose.
Yeah.
You know, and I'm going to talk about this a little more, and I'm guilty of it. And I'll be dead honest with anybody. I hunted a little bit last week and had the opportunity to shoot a doe, and I couldn't do it because we are a buck culture state in a lot of places.
Yeah, still are.
Yeah, and like we're thinking that big buck's coming behind that doe, or there's something else going on. But I'm trying to do a better job of helping it for the future. You know, I
think of the trees.
The trees and just habitat and where we're at, and that's why we do it. But appreciate you coming on, Paul, and anything we can do from our shop. But I guarantee you, myself, our staff, the hunters of Pennsylvania, appreciate everything you're doing out there. And you know, if you have any questions, you know, you guys are GM comments. Be happy to answer anything that we can do. And I know we just had a tour just recently on a game lands in the Northwest where a lot of people went out and looked. A lot of our game land tours are open.
Mm-hmm.
You know, take advantage of those and go out and look at what's happening on the surface.
Yeah, and just try to remember, we're not just cutting trees to cut trees. It's all in pursuit of habitat.
Right. So part one, and next part we're going to get David Stainbrook on, and we're going to talk about the deer and a lot of our efforts that are happening right now. And obviously, you guys work in tandem together a lot, and from a bureau perspective, because it all goes hand in hand. Everything we do creates that outcome, that vision that we're trying to achieve, and trying to keep Pennsylvania is the best place in the country, in my opinion, when it comes to wildlife.
Absolutely, and we're going to try to keep that like that into the future. Maybe improve it a little bit.
Well, thank you, Paul. Don't be scared to stop by and show us good pictures.
Will do.
Okay, buddy.
Have a good